Your camera is limited in a few ways, with the rate at which it can process and transfer data being a key restriction. There are two main settings you have to balance to fit within your available bandwidth: resolution and frame rate. The higher the resolution, the higher the bandwidth requirements per frame. A 4K frame has 4 times as many pixels as a 1080p frame, and therefore requires around 4 times the bandwidth per frame. This is why, as you increase the resolution of your shot, the highest available frame rates to shoot reduces. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that your camera is capable of processing data at 100 megabits per second, and also assume that you are shooting in PAL. You can choose a 4K resolution at 25 FPS or 1080p at 25, 50 or 100 FPS. This means that for every second that passes, you have up to 100 megabits of bandwidth to play with. At 25 frames per second, you have 4 megabits of data per frame. Doubling this to 50 frames per second halves your data to 2 megabits per frame. And at 100 frames per second, you're limited to each frame having a maximum size of 1 megabit. As you can see, there is a direct correlation between increasing your frame rate and reducing the quality of your image. A frame from 25 FPS has 4 times the bandwidth to utilise as one from 100 FPS. If shot well, most people won't notice the difference in quality, but it is there. Earlier I said to you that you need to have your timeline match your camera's base frame rate. We will cover editing and timelines in detail in the editing section, so this next little bit is just to help you grasp the bigger picture of why the choice of frame rates is so important. Let's visualize it. When your timeline is the same as your camera's base frame rate, you can see that each of our available frames perfectly lines up on each of the timeline available frame slots. All of the data is used. You can still easily use higher frame rates in multiples playing back at your base frame rate, but you have to throw away some of the excess frames shot that don't line up with your timeline. The key thing to understand is that so long as this is the case, you can cleanly play back your footage without having to compute or estimate missing frames, which happens when your footage doesn't match the frames of your timeline, such as this example of a 30 FPS shot on a 25 FPS timeline. Messing this up is what causes artifacts and stuttering in the video playback of your final edit. Don't worry if you don't quite get what's going on next, as it will be covered in more detail in the editing section. On the screen we have a second of frames for both a 25 FPS timeline and 30 FPS footage. You can see that if we overlay these, then they do not line up. When your editing software renders this timeline, it will either generate a new frame based on the 2 closest frames. This is what tends to cause visual glitches, as the computer guesses what the frame should look like, or it will choose the nearest frame, resulting in irregular timings as your frames get moved about, and some drop frames as it deletes the frames it doesn't use. This is what causes skipping and your video to look choppy. Knowing this, watch this clip again and look at the arms and hands of the dancer. Because they are moving the most, there is the largest difference between each frame, exaggerating the issue. So why film at higher frame rates? You should only film at higher frame rates if you intend to slow the footage down and make use of the data you allocated to those extra frames over a higher quality on less frames. I'm always an advocate of shooting to edit. If you aren't slowing down your footage, choose the highest available resolution and your base frame rate. A perfect example is a shot where someone is talking, like I am to you now. You want to maximize the detail, and adjusting the speed of the shot would just make it unnatural. This is a shot where you definitely wouldn't want mismatching frame rates, such as 30 FPS on a 25 FPS timeline. You would have to botch it to make it work. However, let's say you want a gorgeous slow-mo shot. Then you sacrifice your data per frame for more frames, giving you the room to spread them out later on in your edit and slow down the footage. If you want to slow your footage by 50%, choose the frame rate that is double your timelines. If you want 25% speed, then you're going to have to choose a frame rate that is quadruple what your final timeline is. Pre-planning the slow motion speeds that you are going to want to use allows you to assign the maximum data per frame. Here is a music video I filmed entirely in 50 FPS.
I got Seth to sing at 2 times the song's normal speed when filming, and then slowed all the footage down by 50% onto a 25 FPS timeline. It resulted in him singing at a normal speed, but then the rest of the world being in slow motion. This made his movement and what was going on in the frame behind him very disconnected from reality, giving him the alien feel he was chasing to represent what he was singing in his song.
If you intend for extreme slow motion, you may want to consider hiring a specialist camera for the shoot. If you are interested in seeing what can be achieved with slow motion, I highly recommend checking out the slow-mo guys on YouTube. You can also use computer-generated frames to slow down your footage, but with varying levels of success. We will cover this in the editing section. Let's talk a little bit about the middle ground. Many of you won't have this luxury, but in an ideal world, your camera will be capable of capturing high quality at high frame rates.
For example, this is a shot from a Blackmagic entry-level cinema camera. It is filmed at 6K, 50 FPS with a bit rate of 400 megabits per second, about 4 times higher than your average mirrorless camera, such as a Sony a7 Mark III. This allows us to both have an incredible digital zoom, with 300% leaving us at 1080p, and the ability to cleanly reduce speed by 50% while still retaining a great looking image.
And you can do all this without a noticeable loss in quality. There are 2 other topics to be aware of on this subject. The first is light exposure. A recap from the exposure video is that our shutter speed regulates the amount of light that hits our camera sensor. For the best and most natural motion blur, we have to have this set to double our frame rate. This means that as our frame rate increases for those really nice slow-mo shots, the amount of time our shutter can be open per frame decreases, resulting in the same shot needing an increased amount of exposure by either adding artificial light, dropping the aperture down to lower f-stops, or increasing the ISO if the other options aren't available. The second is personal preference. Although the theoretical best frame rate for quality, motion blur, and video viewing is around 25 FPS, it's ultimately down to you, how you the creator want your video to look. You may prefer to choose higher frame rates, such as a 50 FPS timeline and final video, to chase that smoother feel. Just remember that if your base frame rate is higher, you will have to shoot at even higher frame rates in order to slow your footage down cleanly. In summary, frame rates are extremely important. You want to keep them at your base frame rate and maximum resolution unless you are intending to slow the shot down later, in which case you want to turn up your frame rates to achieve the percentage speed reduction you are after. See you soon.